no matter how good your project management is and your scope management and how quick and efficient you are at delivering things, like if you're setting yourself up for failure, then you're going to suffer. And that the only way to fix that is to get clear on it. Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel Petitpas. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. Joining us again today is the wonderful Kristen Kelly. Kristen, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Marcel.
It's exciting to talk about something that we've been talking about a lot more recently, I think in a public setting, which is pricing, a really important piece of running a profitable firm, of course, setting yourself up for success from the start. So why don't you tee us up for today's conversation? What are we going to be digging into?
Yeah. So I think, pricing is one of those things that tends to get overcomplicated just because most agencies don't have a framework for it. And without a framework, there isn't an anchor, and it's easy to arrive at a price or pricing strategy that might not set the agency up for success. So we're here today to get into some of the most common pricing mistakes we see and how to go about fixing them.
Awesome. Well, yes, lots of mistakes that we see. This is actually one of the most shocking things, because I tend to ask about this even before we start working with clients. I like to know, how do you arrive at a price when a client asks you for something? How do you get to that price point? What is the thinking or the heuristic or the math behind it? And it is alarming how little there is any substance to the actual thinking or math that goes into a price. So yeah, let's unpack it.
All right, so let's just dive straight in. My mistake number one, pricing based on guesswork. So let's talk a little bit more about what that looks like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've seen this a number of times before, which is the answer to the question of how do you come up with the price is something to the tune of, we try to figure out what other people are charging. We try to figure out what the client, can afford, what the market will bear. And we sort of stick our finger in the air and throw out a price based on that. Or maybe they're using a rate card and it's like, well, we kind of, take what we used to do at the old firm that we were at, or what, I know my friend's firm is doing. And we just sort of, estimate some hours, apply a buffer and multiply it by this rate card to arrive at a price. And I think the key issue with that framework is when I double click and I say, okay, great. How do you know if that price is good or if that price is bad, or if the rate on your rate card is good or if it's bad? And if it's setting you up for profitability, I'm often met with, a bit of a blank stare. And not much of an answer. And that to me is alarming, right? It's not to say that every single project that you bid out needs to be the golden goose that's going to solve all your profitability problems, but you should at least have an understanding of what you're setting yourself up for, what the expectations are, what trade-offs you're making. And very few firms seem to have a pricing system that sets them up for that. I think part of that is because it can be very complicated and overwhelming to try to get there without an understanding of how to do it. But a lot of times it's just sort of thinking more vibe pricing than anything else.
Vibe pricing, coined a new term. Yeah, I like it. Yeah, I mean, for some of my clients, I see this almost show up as not guesswork so much, but relying on, they have got clients where the clients just got a set budget. And so, rather than figure out, how to scope according to that fixed budget. They just kind of take that as, the price, and it's not so much guesswork. It's just like, okay, we'll take that and work with what you give us.
Yeah. And the danger with that is, I think this is some of the pushback I get to when I talk about pricing in the way that we like to talk about it, which is like, you got to understand your gross margins and your delivery margins and work backwards from those things. And people are like, yeah, but sometimes the client, if I was trying to make a great margin on every project, clients would never buy from us because we price ourselves out of the market. And like, I get that. Sometimes you do just have to discount your rate. Sometimes you do just have to take a lower margin to win the work. Sometimes that's the appropriate decision, because if you don't, then your utilization is going to suck next month. And like, that's fine. but we should just be clear about those things. We should be crystal clear about, I'm going to discount this project, or we're going to do more scope than we probably should for this price. And these are the mathematical implications of that. And we are comfortable with that. And we expect this project to go this way. Because what happens oftentimes when we don't do that is we get to the end of the project and we do a retro, and then everyone's pissed off. And we're like, oh, we blew through the budget. This project wasn't profitable enough. And the reality is we set ourselves up for that from the start. But for whatever reason, the way that we're pricing, the way we're documenting those things didn't make that clear. And then it feels like a failure at the end, when in reality, we might have had a very successful project relative to expectations, but we just didn't document those expectations in the right way.
Yeah. They basically didn't, complete a scoping exercise to determine the amount of effort that's going into, what's tied to a price. Yeah.
And this sort of ties back to a thing that we've been talking about a lot recently on the show, but I think is important, right? Which is insight is a function of expectations versus reality. And we see that show up at all kinds of different levels of the organization in terms of reporting, but pricing is like a really, really important place where we need to be paying attention to that, because there's no amount of execution that will fix the problem of we are consistently setting ourselves up for failure when we price things. Right? No matter how good your project management is and your scope management, and how quick and efficient you are at delivering things, like if you're setting yourself up for failure, then you're going to suffer. And that the only way to fix that is to get clear on it.
All right. So mistake number 2, undercharging and over-delivering.
Well, we've covered this a little bit already, but I think the key idea here is that I don't think enough firms understand how much margin is really required to be profitable and to set the business up to be able to not only deliver the work profitably, but then also cover all the other things that it needs to cover, such as overhead and unutilized time and all the other costs that go into running the business. And so I think this is where you get into a lot of confusion around, we have this heuristic, but that heuristic is often not setting the client up for enough profitability. So for example, just the other day, I spoke to a firm where I asked them for their heuristic, and they were essentially, what they described in very different language is, we're aiming for a 50% direct delivery margin when we sell something. And immediately I was like, okay, that's a problem, because if you're only aiming for 50%, that means you're probably ending up at closer to 30% on the profit and loss statement, which means probably all of that margin is going to paying for your overhead, which means you have essentially no profitability in the business. And that is exactly what was going on. They were essentially running at break even as a firm. And so it was like, okay, to me, it is immediately clear what the problem is. You need to be charging more like a 70% direct delivery margin when you sell things. And so the big idea here is, I really hate the idea of trying to price to net profit. In a way, you have to work back from net profit, but I think that idea is fundamentally profitable. But understand that generally, when you think about what is the direct cost that we're going to incur to get this project done, let's say that direct cost is $1,000 worth of your team's time. At a minimum, you should be generally aiming for a 70% margin on that cost. So the other way to think about that is divide whatever your cost is by 0.3. And that'll give you sort of the minimum price that you need to charge before adding on pass-through expenses and other sort of hard costs. And I really feel like not enough firms are clear on just how much margin they need to be applying to things, or the heuristic that they're using is not accounting for all the costs that they need to cover.
Yeah. I think part 2 to that is, once you've just determined, once you've arrived at that margin and figure out what you need to actually charge as a price, it's establishing those guardrails then for the day to day. So having a process in place for clear language in the contracts, what does this entail? A formal policy for what to do when a client requests something outside of that scope. Really, without those things, everything can kind of fall apart after, the contract's signed.
We're going to get into this when we talk about pricing models a little bit later, but not really considering the nature of the work, what sort of mechanisms are available to you in the type of engagement that you've gone into with the client. Because if it's a fixed scope, the way you have that conversation and handle scope changes is very different than if you're doing a time materials project, for example. That's a really important thing. And a great hack that I'll share here, and this is, a shout out to my good friend Jason Swank, who taught me this one, is the $0 change order. I shared this with somebody just last week, and they thought it was like the coolest thing ever, which is, it's not to say that you can't ever do extra things for clients that come up, right? Sometimes that's just the right thing to do, or, it's what you need to do to kind of keep the relationship intact or to make sure the project is successful. But he was like, the person I was speaking to was like, but how do you do that without setting this expectation that they can just start asking you for whatever they want? Because that's like the fear that every project manager has, right? Is like, this train is going to leave the station and it's going to be running away on us. And the simple hack was the $0 change order, which is you do it for them at no cost, but you create a change order and you put in what it would have cost them, and you cross that out and you mark it as 0 and you get them to sign it. And you do that for the first time. You maybe do that for the second time. Then by the third time, you've made it explicitly clear that, like, hey, this is out of scope and we did it for you anyway, and we're doing you a solid. And it doesn't start to feel like the scope itself is just sort of nebulous. So that's a nice little trick for helping with the over delivering part.
I love that hack. Yeah, I think at a previous agency, we had just included it as value add on invoices, for example, and just, put what it was. But that's a less passive aggressive way of doing it, right? That's just being very direct, putting a change off in front of them. And yeah, makes sense to me.
Yeah. And, what I also like about this is it's really good hygiene for scope, because it comes back to this thing that we just talked about, which is expectations, right? So like, you should have a process where if the scope of the engagement changes, then whatever your source of truth is, in our case, that would be the project grid, your source of truth for what are the expectations around this project should get updated. And so if you have a process triggered to every time that a contract or a scope of work is signed, it goes through updating the expected hours, the expected price, all of the different things that need to be updated for this project to be up to date. It's just a good forcing function for hygiene, because it treats the scope as a thing that needs to be managed. And so, like, if the scope is changing, the scope is changing. So the scope is changing and you need to change the scope.
That's a good PM tidbit that we just shared. Really like that one. All right. So mistake number 3, ignoring overhead and profit in your pricing. We talked a little bit about this with, the 70%.
So there's some nuance to this, right? Here's what I don't think is a good idea. Using a net profit like heuristic to arrive at pricing and trying to measure the performance of pricing of projects based on net profit. That idea to me is fundamentally flawed. Like, it doesn't actually make any sense if you really try to do it. It's so time consuming, it's so expensive, and then it's actually very inaccurate for the majority of the reasons that you would try to do any of those things. That doesn't mean that you should ignore overhead, but there's a smarter way to factor it into the way that you price and the way that you measure performance. I wrote a really long article on this. I'll try to make sure that I link it in the show notes here. But here's the big idea is you're generally going to spend between 20 and 30% of your agency gross income on overhead. You're generally going to spend another 10 to 20% of your agency gross income on what we call indirect delivery expenses, which would be like the software subscriptions that you just sort of have to have for your team to do their work. It doesn't go up and down every time you sign a new client. So this is like your Figma subscription, your Adobe Creative Cloud subscription, your, maybe some of the hosting licenses that you have, the stock footage library, et cetera. And then there's going to be delivery overhead. So the account manager that spends half of their time, in ClickUp, updating a gazillion things and running status meetings for 20 clients at a time. And, their time is not ending up in the timesheets. It's not ending up on the client invoices. It's probably not even really getting estimated into client projects, because so much of it is broadly overseeing the delivery team. This is going to be true about sort of very senior designers, engineers, strategists, copywriters, where they're going to spend some of their time on professional development, holding creative office hours, like working on things that just, it's impossible to get them into the timesheets. You need to account for that cost of the administrative cost almost of running the delivery team. And of course, unutilized time, where ideally everybody would be as busy as you would like them to be all the time. That's probably not going to happen. So you want to account for that buffer. And so right there, if we say 30% on overhead, 20% on indirect delivery expenses, then you could assume that if you want to run at break even, then you need at least 50 cents of every dollar being spent or being kept after a client pays you. So if, let's say, you're targeting a 20% net profit, that's where that 70% direct delivery margin sort of target comes from. So you can account for these things without necessarily on every single project having to load overhead into hourly cost values, without having to try to factor in every little thing. And I think importantly, not having to refresh all of that information on a very consistent basis, because it's constantly going to be changing. And then what you end up with is externalities that are influencing your perception of profitability on a given project, both at the pricing level, but also at the performance level. Like if you were trying to measure net profit per project, and I use air quotes when I say that, because like, again, it doesn't make any sense, then what you're going to end up with is this constantly fluctuating measurement that doesn't actually mean anything, because what is the profit of a project this month versus last month? If utilization and overhead are constantly fluctuating, you won't actually be able to tell if things are getting better or worse. So that's the big idea with you factoring in overhead. You want to do it, but bake it into your whatever you want to call it, gross margin. We would call it direct delivery margin. You might call it contribution margin, but bake it into that level of target. Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our Agency Profitability Toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. With that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
I'm going to keep us going to the next mistake. So using the wrong pricing model for the work. This is a meaty one that we also talked about a little bit earlier. Let's talk about what that looks like.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of good content on this. We've done a couple of podcast episodes on it before, so I'm not going to go all the way into this, but we have a framework for this, right? We call it the Agency Pricing Quadrant, and essentially what it looks at is like the two biggest factors that you would consider when determining what the ideal pricing model is for a given engagement. Those two factors are value and risk, right? So number one, are we considering value in the engagement? And this kind of cuts both ways. In some cases, you might be selling something to a client where they have very few options to compare you to. Like you're an absolute expert in solving this problem for companies just like theirs. They can't find another firm like yours, right? So that's high value. And second, solving this problem for them or getting them this outcome is massively valuable to their business. It could be creating tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of upside for them. In a case like that, that probably means that we want to find a way to capture some of that value in our pricing. And we were probably going to charge them a different amount than we would charge the average bear. And hopefully try to shoot for a much higher margin on that price than we otherwise would. Whereas the other side of this is maybe you've drank, we've seen clients do this. You drink a big tall glass of the value pricing Kool-Aid, and now all of a sudden you're, expecting the local pizza shop to pay you $100,000 for a logo. That doesn't really make sense either. So you have to be realistic about how much value is there in this engagement and use a pricing model that's appropriate. And then the second side of that coin is risk, right? And I think this is the one that we all intuitively think about, but we're not objectively often having this conversation of how reasonable is it for me to try to predict upfront what it will cost us to get this done for the client, how much time it will take us, right? How many contractors and freelancers and pass-through expenses we're going to incur to get this thing done. And there's certain types of work that are just going to be really unpredictable, either because we've never done them before, or because the client doesn't know what the hell they want, or because the scope of the engagement is just absolutely massive and there's a lot of things that could change, or because the way we have to solve this problem is inherently iterative, where we're just going to sort of learn as we go. And so we have to consider whether we can predict this or not. And the long and short is, if you have low value, high risk work, selling hours is actually a pretty good solution in that case, as long as you make your 70% margin on that hour, right? It's not true that you can't scale a business doing that. There's billion-dollar businesses selling hours all over the world. The second one is high value, high risk. That's where we think about abstracted time materials. So we're abstracting generally on 3 vectors. Instead of selling hours, we might sell days, weeks, biweekly sprints, months. Instead of selling individuals, we might sell cross-functional teams, right? So a group of people, an engineering team, a design team. And instead of selling time, we might sell different sort of units. So it could be story points. It could be our own sort of little internal currency. And we're just basically still selling time, but we're abstracting away from the hour and trying to create more space to capture value in that process, but benefiting from the risk sharing that selling time allows us to have as a company. So if it takes longer, we still get paid. And on the other side of that, we have low value, low risk, which is generally where flat pricing or productized pricing does really well. and then high value, high risk, which is typically where we get into different forms of value-based pricing. So that's sort of the big idea with identifying the right pricing model. If you want to learn more about that, we'll make sure to link to a much deeper set of content on that in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect. All right, mistake number 5, not tracking average billable rate, ABR.
Yeah. And this is both at the start and at the end of an engagement. And so, the big idea here is what we're trying to get at is delivery margin, direct delivery margin. We talked about that earlier. We want to aim for about a 70% direct delivery margin. But maybe you just don't have the level of sophistication or the tooling to be able to measure that on an ongoing basis in your project. So the next best thing that you can do, and everybody can do this, if anybody tells me, no, we can't figure out our average billable rate, you're lying, is average billable rate. This is such an easy thing to calculate. You take your agency gross income, which is basically whatever a client's paying you that's actually yours. So after you strip out the money that wasn't yours to begin with, like the Facebook ads and the media budget and the travel expenses and the third party, outsourced vendor that you brought in that, like you don't care about the profitability of that money. So AGI is what's your money divided by the number of hours that you think it will take to get this done. And that will give you an effective rate, right? We're expecting to make $150 for every hour of effort that we put into this thing. And that is independent of your pricing model. You could be selling hours, sprints, you could be taking a percent of ad spend, you could be doing a value-based price, like doesn't matter. What do you expect to get paid? What do you expect to spend in terms of time to get it done? That nets out to an effective rate. And then the sort of hack here is what I call Kirkland brand delivery margin, which is you take your average cost per hour, you contrast it to the average billable rate, and it gives you a rough sense of how much margin you expect to make on that thing. So let's say, for example, you had a $50 average billable rate, you had a $50 average cost per hour and $150 average billable rate. Then you would have an expected direct delivery margin of about 66.7%. Right? So it tells you, okay, we're sort of in the ballpark here. And as the scope increases, right, so the number of hours you expect goes up or the price changes, you sort of have a sense of, are we going to end up in the right ballpark? And if you know what your average cost per hour is, then you can sort of set a watermark and say, okay, roughly this rate is what we're trying to aim for or higher. This is sort of the floor. We can't take stuff that's below this unless it's extenuating circumstances. That is such a simple hack to help you understand, like, okay, are we in the right ballpark? And then it also gives you a really simple thing to compare performance to at the end, where all you have to do, again, is say, how much did we get paid? How much time went in? And how different was that from what we expected? And that is it's such a simple hack, but so powerful. And it gives you a lot of insight into if you're setting yourself up for success and what's going wrong if you're getting to the end of the projects and you're still not making money.
Yeah. With a lot of my clients, one of the first things we do together is go through an exercise like that with all of their core service lines where, they've got their benchmark ABR and we just figure out right out the gate, what are they planning to achieve from an ABR perspective and work on improving that from there. All right. Mistake number 6, fear of raising prices.
Fear of raising prices. Well, to be fair, this fear is often warranted. Some clients will leave when you raise your prices, but the math here is the percentage of revenue that's going to leave your business higher than the percent of revenue that's going to be incurred by increasing your price? And in the vast majority of pricing increase studies, what we find is that there's just a massive upside to increasing price. Let's say you lose 10% of your clients, but you raise your price by 30%. You've still gained a 20% upside in that situation. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is context, right? And the best possible time for you to raise your prices is when you're busy. And I think this is where people just don't stop and think about that opportunity. We've seen it so many times, right? The client that's busy, and then every new thing that they sell, they scramble to go find new team members to bring on, and they're just sort of piling the work on top. And underneath that pile of new work is like the client that's been here for 10 years and their scope and price, their scope has increased, but the price has never changed and we're losing money on them. That is the perfect opportunity to go to that client and say, hey, I think it's time that we discuss your changing needs and how we can better support you going forward. And if they decide to bounce, then instead of going and hiring a whole bunch of new people and taking on new costs to handle the new clients that are coming, you just sort of replace them. And so just understand that, sure, like if you're in a position where if you lost a client, it would be like devastating to you, then yeah, that is scary. And you probably shouldn't be raising your prices on existing clients in that moment, but probably still be doing it on the front end. But if you're busy, that's a really good place to sort of go clean up some of those old legacy clients that are not serving you anymore, because there's really no way to lose in that situation. Either you end up with 2 better quality clients, or you end up replacing a bad quality client with a new one that's at a higher quality. So that's my thoughts on fear of raising prices. And if that all of that fails, then I don't know, go do 5 MEO in a Peruvian jungle and have an enlightenment moment, and maybe your trauma and fear of money will erode, and then you'll never have problems with this ever again.
Also a solution. Speaking of solutions, so we've talked about a bunch of those today. One that probably sums up many of them is pricing with delivery margin in mind. So let's kind of put a bow on that.
Yeah, that's really it. To me, like the simplest, most important thing that anybody can do in their pricing is just know what they expect their delivery margin to be when they sell something, and try to make sure that it's 70% or higher. And if you do that, assuming that you're like a reasonably normal agency, you're not on some like fringe case. And we have seen this, some agencies that don't need that much, some agencies that need a lot more, but the vast majority, if you can be at 70% or higher, you'll be in a good position. And so if you walk away with nothing else, just please let it be that you will try to calculate this before you sell anything to anyone in the future, and just make sure that you know it. And again, if you choose to discount because you need the work, or like, that's fine, but just know what the expectation is when you sell it, so that when you go back to look at what happened at the end of the project, you have a clear understanding of what you're setting yourself up for. And this, I think, will solve a lot of the other challenges that people run into with pricing, the confusion, the huge complicated spreadsheets, the disagreements internally about what the expectations were, the underscoping things because the team feels like they're not allowed to discount. Like, there's so many things that get wrapped up in just pricing model issues that we've seen solved with just a simple idea of just understand the delivery margin. That's it, across whatever you sell. We do have some content that talks about how to do that in more practical ways, which we will link in the show notes.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you what the first step is for someone who wants to get a handle on this.
Yeah, so check the show notes. There'll be some links to some free resources to teach you the math on how to do that. The formula is very simple. Agency gross income minus delivery costs divided by agency gross income. That's your direct delivery margin. So super simple. And of course, if all of this is overwhelming and you need help with it, these are the kinds of conversations we're having with clients all the time. So I do encourage you to reach out and schedule a consultation if getting some hands-on help with this is something that you think you'd benefit from.
Comprehensive chat. Thank you, Marcel.
Thank you, Kristen. I had a good time, and I hope everyone else had a good time listening to me rant about pricing. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day, because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.